Hi, thank you. I need to ask all of you a favor first, which is that, I work with a very tiny team in Los Angeles for my company, and leaving them for an entire week actually feels like kind of leaving my kids at home. So would you guys do me a huge favor and just really quickly wave at my team in Los Angeles? Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it. They really appreciate everything that we've been learning here together today. I want to start by saying thank you so much for your intellectual generosity over the last 48 hours. I think I might have had the best job here in the last 48 hours to get to see the excitement with which you were leaving the sessions and then furiously scribbling down things and smacking them on the board. So, Sarah Watson gets done with her session and then everybody comes out and is smacking things on the board about data, right? And then we get out of the robotics session and everybody's like, oh, robots! And then is smacking things on the board about robots. So it's been really, really exciting to see how each session spurs us on to further development. So I want to make some observations because I do actually have a background in anthropology, and I didn't realize how important that was going to be 10 years later, over the last 48 hours, to just get to kind of watch and observe how everyone's behaving around these ideas. Pushing to the edges of what the future might be is scary and uncomfortable. And the first approach I got from many people was a sticker that had on it their official future. This is what I want to be true about the future. And that's very common, actually, in this scenario building process, and it's why it takes us some time to really get through it.
That's also okay, though.
That's totally great, because we need to have a sense of where we would like to go to figure out how are we going to get there. And it's harder to say how we will get there. So what we would often have are conversations about, okay, if you would like that to be true in the future, what else would have to be true? What would have to happen? There was a lot of discussion about where we are now, and it was really interesting because we have a lot of multicultural, multi-country perspectives about where we are now. And then some people had really big questions. Is it even possible to know where we are with respect to data? Is there enough transparency even for us to make that judgment? So I wanted to, this was my most surprising revelation, perhaps for this group, because it is such an incredibly well-educated, forward-thinking, mind-expanding group of people. And yet, we seem to be incredibly powerfully influenced by the media perceptions that we have about imagining things. So everybody wanted to talk about utopias and dystopias. And they would use these literary references, which I was pleased to notice a lot of us share. We've read 1984, or we've read Lord of the Flies, or many others. And actually, if afterwards you could tell me what are some Swedish utopias and dystopias that I should be reading, I'd be really interested to learn them. But that our ability to imagine the future is intensely influenced by the media that we have consumed. And so perhaps that would be my argument for why anybody working in media might right now have the most important cultural job moving forward, because it's affecting our ability to imagine what we can become. So it's, and basically in saying that, it's very hard to look at a future that we don't already have a powerful story to describe, which is why, in fact, we tend to go to our official future first, because we know how to talk about that one. And because of the nature of the matrix, while the sessions really focused a lot on the substance of the content, the storytelling, its longevity, its stickiness, its beauty, what we talked about outside was a lot more about the distribution and ownership of that content, which, as I would discover, provokes a lot of anxiety for people as well. So, I pushed back on a lot of you who came to me with official futures, because I think that was my job, to say, if you want this to be true, how do we get there? And oftentimes we would end up in conversations about, I actually don't think the conditions will come to exist anytime soon to see out my official future. And what will that mean for me? So I don't by any means have major conclusions to draw for you. I can only present you with some of my findings and give you some tools to continue to use this framework and the things you've learned here and the conversations you have to push forward. So I'm going to use some of Brian Reed's tools about helping you continue to frame the stories from the future to inform the present. So when you start to think about what is at the edges of the 4 quadrants, you want to think about action. What is the stuff that will happen? Tell me the actual actions that people and companies will take to get us to the upper right or lower left corner. Who are the winners and losers? What are the stakes? Who stands to gain and at whose loss? That's very, very important. And then his point of reflection in telling a historical story is about somebody reflecting on something they did do. And the interesting thing about telling a story from the future is once you figure out what the actions that will be taken and what the stakes are held for those actions, the reflection becomes, what will you do? So here's the matrix as it was at about 4:30 when this photo was taken. It's about how long I've had to make this presentation. And I want to point out a couple of things. Where we think we are, the green dots, by the way, were where we think we are. And there's not total disagreement about it, and there was a little bit of bifurcation. But as I spoke to people, most people feel, so those dots up there are Google and YouTube. This is Facebook over here. A lot of the really big players, the things that we use every day in our lives, we feel like are pretty centralized, at least in their consumption and distribution, if not in their creation is distributed, but the consumption and distribution is quite centralized. So that was an interesting thing to learn, is that we kind of think we're here. Although somebody pointed out to me, I think this is very fascinating, that Sweden is actually kind of centralized but transparent, and yet no Swedish people came up and put a dot in that category. So I want you to look at that
Maybe
later
it's
on.
invisible if you live here.
Where we'd like to be, actually quite favored decentralized. This didn't surprise me very much. What did surprise me, I guess, is that while a lot of people started their conversations with me very excited about transparency and decentralization, as we talked more, they were like, oh no, I would actually really like more privacy with my decentralization rather than less. And that I thought was an interesting takeaway. And the fact that there aren't very many dots in this upper left quadrant means that it is the most important one for us to continue to examine, because it's the one that probably scares us a little bit. It's the one that's hardest to imagine that we don't yet have powerful stories to describe. And that's not because it's not important or that it couldn't happen. I know. I know. Okay? I'm going to do a quick synopsis of the big ideas, and maybe we can make this available to everyone. I'll certainly tweet a link to it and stuff like that.
We can absolutely make it available. Yeah.
Okay, so the far end of the upper right quadrant, no more World Cup, is a massive decentralization that leads to the dissolution of the nation state. And of course, we don't have World Cup anymore because there's no nations to compete against one another. Sorry, football fans. And things like in 2014, the events in Ferguson, Missouri lead to the massive adoption of CCTV, not for the state to examine the citizen, but for the citizen to examine the state. And that's part of the trigger that moves us towards a massive decentralization. So what I'm talking about like plausible stories that move us outward. Some things I think are really interesting in here is that we have a society of innovation, not invention, because innovation can happen with individuals. Invention takes a lot of resources. With massive distribution or decentralization, that will be harder. I build my own robot, and then I use the open source software to program it, because of course, if anybody saw Nell and Amir's session, the future has robots in it, no matter which direction we go. They're just going to be different, sort of differently abled robots, depending. In the lower right, this is where we wanted to go. We're very excited about this Techno Utopia. In 2015, users take back ownership of their data from social networks. We build local mesh networks. We all learn how to use Bitcoin and do banking on our own terms. And we build linked data where the metadata about the permissions that we want to give people about our data goes linked with our data. So we actually have this powerful control over how it goes. However, we may also end up with closed internet groups and sectarianism. And then this might be a circumstance in which artificially intelligent robots go, "No, I don't want you to know anything about me." And so there's a robots' rights movement. The upper right here is the Hive Mind. This is radical transparency, but quite a bit of consolidation. This was the one that we didn't really want to talk about, but the first sticker that went up in this side was Hive Biology, which I think is really fascinating, because after the robot talk, somebody came out and talked to me about this quadrant and said, this is the quadrant in which we accelerate towards the singularity. That's kind of a big idea, right? And then in this lower...
the singularity would be machines becoming conscious.
Yeah, this would be a sort of massive hive consciousness that is humans and machines become indistinguishable from one another, and it's all totally transparent and belongs to sort of one giant system.
I see why we'd be worried about that quadrant.
It could be scary, yeah. But there's also, part of this scenario is that privacy becomes a commercial service. That, I think, is something we need to be thinking about. And then in this quadrant is the one where we think we are now. And of course, the further we move in this direction, the scarier it gets. Corporations subsume the nation state, even society. We have greater harmony and efficiency because there's sort of like one person calling the shots. But there are things like big data discrimination that trickles down to genetic discrimination. And the robots, this is very iRobot state. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie. If you haven't, it's terrible, but it's worth watching just for this. But this is the Panopticon, and now we're looping all the way back to Molly at the very beginning. So profoundly, we agreed we want to move from here to here. And yet when I asked people to tell me the story of how we get there, nobody could tell me a very convincing story of how we move from a place where Google already knows everything about us to a place where we get to decide what they know about us. I don't entirely understand yet how we get there. And that's what I think really warrants further reflection. Because I think there is a path that might look something like this, that's going to be very painful and probably wrought with conflict. That's something that is worth considering if that is the direction that we ultimately want to move. So what do we know about the future? That we don't know what's going to happen. And yet, today and tomorrow and for the rest of our lives, we have to make informed decisions based on what we think might happen. So what? So why did they ask me here to do this, and why am I taking your time? Because I'm really interested in what you will do. And as I was sort of bringing this all together, I was asked to make a suggestion about what perhaps next year's conference might be like based on sort of what I got to see people's takeaways were from this one. And there were two ideas that stood out to me really radically in the last 5 hours I was here. Skylar, whose name I may have misspelled, I apologize, was talking about distributing the work into the materials, which was a really radical notion to me and totally brain-blowing. Nell then was talking, in the machine learning, was talking about distributing human values into the robots. So that if you distribute the work into the materials, that's kind of less stuff that we have to worry about. If you distribute human values into robots, that's less ethical questions that we have to ask ourselves. And so then I want to ask the question, what about distributing our desire for the future into the data itself and into the content itself? What if we built systems that did actually provide linked data, that did distribute content and data across systems that we felt we trusted, that we felt we controlled, that we felt were local? And if we were going to do that, what would have to be true? So my suggestion for the conference 2015 is a radical rethinking of information design and architecture, how it's built, how it's distributed, reassembled, and recycled. Could we build a diagram that looked like Skylar's of what we want materials to do for information, data, and content? And I would love to continue this conversation. So please tweet at me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you.